Hi everyone, it's Tammy with Shabby Fabrics. I have a beautiful quilt here. This is Cherish. This is done with a fabric from Clothworks. Cherish Quilt we put out a while ago and it sold out immediately. And we had so many people wanting more that we talked to Clothworks and they did a special printing just for us. So we have very limited kits left on this on the second printing. And if you didn't get it the first time, you need to definitely get it quick because we're not going to be able to make any more kits after this. Once it's gone, it's gone. I am here today because I'm going to show you how to make this quilt block. We thought it was important. It's a square and a square. And while square and a square might seem simple, I want to give you some finer points of that to make your blocks come out nice. So that's what we're going to do. Also, I should mention I have on my table the Fold and Blooms kit. This is a really nice little accent piece you can do that will go on your dining room table or your entryway to accent with your quilt. Very pretty. I love the soft colors. So let's get started and make a quilt block. All right. So first of all, we have our pattern and I'm just going to set this up here. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make some half square triangles. So I have pre-cut these ahead of time. So to make a half square triangle, we oversize our squares. So you don't have to worry that your seams have to be oh so perfect. All right. They're oversized and we are going to square them up. I'm going to show you how to do that. All right, so I'm going to use a Creative Grids 2.5 by 12.5 inch ruler. I love this ruler for marking lines. So I'm just going to place it corner to corner on my white like this. I like a friction pen and it's just right on. Okay, draw that line corner to corner. I'm going to take this one off and show you an alternate marking method here. Let's say you would rather have a line to sew on and a line to cut on, which I understand that. So we have a little Creative Grids seam guide. This is a very nice tool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to line it up on my fabric. So I'm putting the point of my fabric here and the other point of my fabric here. So I know it's exactly in the center. I'm going to hold on to it. I'm going to draw a line on this side. That's a sewing line. And let's put a line on the other side. There we go. A line on the other side. Now I have sewing lines on both sides of this. So now if I just want to sew on these two lines, we can do that and then cut it apart in the center. All right. So let's take this to the machine. I'm just going to add a couple of pins just to stabilize my fabric. So I'm going to use a fine patchwork pin. We're just going to kind of stabilize our fabric. I just want to hang on to it. I don't want to put pins anywhere near where I'm sewing. I'm going to keep them way away from the needle on my sewing machine. All right, so I'm going to go sew these together and I'll see you at the sewing machine. Okay, so what I did is I sewed onto the two lines that we drew. Now I'm just going to cut this with a rotary cutter straight down the middle. And I have two half square triangles. Now, if we were going to make this by just one line in the middle, let's take a look at what that looks like. Now I'm just going to use my foot on my sewing machine, my presser foot, as my guide. And I know I have a 1/4 inch foot on, so I'm just going to sew a 1/4 inch on either side. I'm just going to run the edge of my foot right along this seam. So let's go do that. Okay, so as before, now I'm going to cut on the line. All right, let's do that. There we go. So either method that you pick, they both work. You're still going to get a half square triangle. This. So now I'm going to press this towards the printed fabric. I don't want to press it towards the white. I'm going to press it towards the printed fabric. I'll set my seam and open this up and press. I want to point out that I'm not using steam in this iron. This is a dry iron. All right, and I am using a wool pressing mat, which I absolutely love. You can see how flat this is. My seams kind of nestle down in the wool when you press it. The wool kind of, I want to say, absorbs the seam kind of. It lets it move down, and so you can press things flatter. All right, that's why I always use a wool pressing mat. All right, so now I'm going to square this up for you to show you how I do this. I have a 4.5-inch square ruler here by Creative Grids. I love that it has this diagonal line, and I'm going to line that up with the diagonal on my half square triangle. All right, so I have my Creative Grids rotating mat. I love this. This is such a nice rotating mat. These are new. We're going to go ahead and use it today. So I'm just going to cut, spin, cut, spin, cut, and spin, and cut, just like that. There we are. Now I have a perfect 4.5-inch half square triangle. Beautiful. All right, we'll set that aside. I'm going to set this aside. Let's go to the square in a square block. That one can be a little tricky. I know it doesn't look tricky, right? You're thinking, well, it's just square in a square. Well, sometimes this block can get away from you, and I understand that. So again, we have a couple of different ways that you can do this. We want 2 blue half square triangles up here and 2 pink on the bottom, all right? So I have my blue fabrics here. On some of these, I have drawn a line, okay? And I would simply lay this on here like this, and I would sew corner to corner. Here's a pink one. We put the pink one on the bottom and sew corner to corner. Okay? That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is I simply have a blue here and a pink here. And I know that my angle of my seam is going to go from this corner to this corner and this corner to this corner. I can use a Creative Grids folded corner clipper. This is going to save me from not only drawing the line, but cutting after I sew it. So we're going to set this down like this. I have a 2.5-inch square, corner to corner. That's where I want that. And I'm just simply going to cut just like that. Let's turn it over and then do exactly the same thing. Lay this down and cut. Okay, now let's put a pin in this. I'm keeping my pins out of my seam allowance. The main thing I want to hold on to is this bottom corner because it's going to try to come apart when I'm sewing this. I want those 2 corners to stay together. Usually everything is fine when you start, right? But it's when you get to the end, everything starts moving apart and you can't fix it because it's already under the presser foot and pretty soon you've sewn it and now your seam's not right. So I'm going to put a pin here to hang on to those 2 corners so that it's not going to move away from me. All right, let's go sew this at the machine. I'll show you how to do that. Okay, we have this sewn, so we'll take out our pins, and let's go ahead and press. I'm going to set my seam and fold this open. When I'm folding this open, I'm making sure that I'm not taking a tuck right here in this seam allowance. Sometimes they have a tendency to tuck on you if you're not watching closely what you're doing. Set your seam, and again, just push the seam open with your fingers. All right, so what you notice here is now the footprint of this 4.5 is exactly like a 4.5. It's still a 4.5 inch square. That's very important. Sometimes these seams can get off a little bit if you're taking too much of a seam allowance or not enough. If you're not taking enough seam allowance, they're going to be too big, right? Or if you're taking too much, they're going to be too small. Anytime you do a square and a square, it's a good way to check that after you add 2 corners, check and make sure that it still is a 4.5 inch square. So now I see that it is, so now I can go ahead and move on to my next squares. All right, so let's do this with the ones that are marked. I'm just going to place them on here. Again, I'm going to just set this bottom corner here where I'm going to sew to. Just set that with a pin. It held it very nicely on the last one. There it is. And I just marked these with a friction pen. Nothing special. I use friction pens all the time when I sew. All right. These are the patchwork pins, the fine patchwork pins. You see how my fabric is still laying very flat. That pin has not disturbed my fabric at all, so it's still exactly where I want it. All right, so we're going to sew. I'm going to sew on the line this time this way and then this way, okay? All right, here we go. Let's take our pins out. Okay, I'm going to trim this to 1/4 inch. So what I like about the Creative Grids rulers is on this side, the side with the white numbers, you have whole inches on this side. But the very first thing they do is they take 1/4 inch and they put a dotted line right there. I love that. I use this edge right here for trimming this because then I know I'm putting a perfect 1/4 inch on my seam allowance. So I just line this dotted line up with my seam. Off it comes. There we go. All right, so let's press this out again. I'm making sure I'm not taking any tucks. But I'm not using steam. Steam will sometimes distort a bias edge. Remember that even though this edge is sewn, it's still a bias edge, right? It's a bias angle. You want to be mindful of it when you're pressing. Okay, there it is. Let's take a look. Here's my 4.5 inch square. Let's take a look. Yep, it's exactly 4.5 inches. All right? Okay. So now let's lay a block out here. Get rid of some of this. Get rid of all this. Kind of clean this up a little bit. How did I make a mess in such a short amount of time, right? Okay. So I have my center square, which is cut to 4.5 inches. We have some half square triangles here that I made ahead of time. So we're going to put our white goes towards the center. White towards the center. There we go. I like to keep my pattern open when I'm doing this. It really helps. I look at this all the time and double check because it's so easy to get things mixed up when you're doing this. Now I want the pink all toward the center because that's going to make my star. Okay. So I have 3 of these done ahead of time. Look at that. Such a pretty block. I love this. Okay, there we go. There's our block. All right, now let's put it together. So just as you'd expect, I'm going to sew by rows, all right? So I usually start here. I'm going to flip this over. Now I have a point right here, right? We want this point to still be a point when we're done. So for that reason, I'm going to sew with my point facing up so that I can keep my eyes on it. So I'm going to pin this point like this. I'm pinning this in the seam allowance. The X marks the spot. So I'm going to sew straight through the middle of that X, and I know that my point is going to be perfect. All right, let's go do that. Okay, now to press this seam, I'm going to press this seam open. I want to sharpen my point, and by pressing this seam open, that's exactly what you're going to do. Also, I have a second point up here. This point I made, see that? This came about with my half square triangle, and I'm going to need to see that point when I'm putting the sashing on this block. So I don't want to cover it up. To keep it open so I can see the X, I would have to push my seam this direction, right? Except that pushes all this fabric back onto this block, and it's going to make a very bulky seam right here where this point is not going to lay flat like I want it to. Therefore, I'm going to open this seam allowance, all right? Let's do that. So I'm going to set my seam, turn my block like this, and I'm just simply going to open that up with my fingers and press that. I'll hold it there for just a minute, turn it over, and press it from the front. That is perfect. That's exactly what I want it to do. All right, let's take a look. Okay, so now you can see this perfect point right here. That's exactly what I want. So now I'm going to, off camera, I'm going to go ahead and sew this together. I'm going to sew this one exactly the same. This one, I'm going to put one on here and one on here. And when I come back, I'll have my rows sewn, and then we will put this together. All right? I'll see you in a minute. Okay, I'm back. I've got all my rows sewn together. Now I wanted to talk to you a little bit about putting the rows together and how I'm going to keep points here and a point in the middle. Here's how I do that. I'm going to fold this over, and I'm going to choose this side to sew up because there are 2 points here and there's only 1 point on the other side. To me, I'd rather have an eye on 2 points rather than just one. Okay? So I'm going to put my seams together, and I've pressed all these seams open so you can see. I think the overhead can grab this. I'll see this, how they're perfectly stacked. I'm going to go ahead and put a pin right here so that when I sew along, you notice I didn't pin this side, I pinned this side. That's because when I'm sewing, the needle kind of tends to push fabric, or the presser foot pushes your fabric along. So as that's pushing, if I pin this right here, it can't push my seam apart. Okay? And if I pinned it over here, I'm afraid I'd have to stop and take a pin out. I don't want to do that. Okay? Let's get the other side pinned. Exactly the same way. I'm going to pin on my right side of my seam like this. All right? That is perfect. All right? Now the seam in the middle, I'm going to figure out where he goes. I'm just simply going to put a pin right here. I'm going to put it at the angle following that seam allowance right there. Okay? So it's just going to hang on to it. I want that to stay right there. I don't want this to slip down because I'm not going to be able to see it. So I definitely want to put a pin there and remind it, I need you to stay right there. Okay, this side, we're going to put a pin here. So I've matched this corner to this corner, and I put a pin here. This one, I'm going to match these two corners, and I'm going to put a pin right here. All right, so it seems like I have a lot of pins, but not really. You put that down. So we have a pin here. This is my point right here for my two intersections. This one's hanging on to the bottom, this one to this point. All right, so let's go sew this at the machine. All right, let's take our pins out and see how we did. Let's turn this over. Of course, I want to see this seam first to make sure that this hit. This is perfect. This hit exactly on that cross, just like I wanted it to. We can check that seam. I want to check my intersections look good. This looks good. All right, let's put the other one on. Here we go. All right, so I'm going to pin these together. I'm going to pin this one together. Oh, you know what? I'm pinning this the wrong way up. Did you guys see that? Like, wait a minute. That's not right. Let's turn this over. I realized it when I only had one point facing me. I went, wait a minute, something's wrong with this picture. Let's do this the other way. There we go. I like that better. I like watching those points. There we go. Pin this seam allowance together. Yep. And now we're going to pin this one right there. Okay, I'll see you at the machine. All right, we have our blocks sewn together. Let's take our pins out here. All right, let's see how we did. Check our seams, perfect. I love that. Okay, so now let's take our block over and let's press it. I'm gonna put it back together like this, and we're gonna press our seams like this. And now I'm gonna press this seam open. There we go, just like before. Now when I go to put the sashing on, when you put the sashing on this quilt, now you have these little colored triangles right here. And I think I'm going to put this up to the camera a little bit so you can see that. You see these dark triangles right here? So now you know your X is right below that. So you're just going to sew right below that point, and you know you're not going to cut this point off when you put your sashing on your quilt. All right? Okay, we'll go ahead and get this one pressed out. I have the 14 by 14 wool pressing mat I'm using. It works great for next door machines, that's for sure. All right, I'm going to give this block a final press. All right, so here we go. We have our completed block. So what I'd like to do is I want to show you this is a 12.5-inch block. So I have a 12.5-inch Creative Grid square ruler. I'm just going to set this on the block, and we can see how this block is perfect. It is 12.5 inches all the way around. I love that. All right, there we go. Thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate your time. If you enjoyed this video, you learned anything, please give me a thumbs up. Make sure you hit the bell to subscribe so you're aware of whenever we release a new tutorial. Again, if you're looking for this Cherish quilt, I wouldn't hesitate to get one. They're going very quickly and we only have a few kits left. So thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you again on another Shabby Fabrics video.